and today we're talking about the game Lusty Ed, called My Teacher, My Obsession, recently renamed Dad Crush, directed by Damien Rome and revolving around Riley, who has transferred to a high school new where her father worked as an English student teacher. Riley initially has difficulty finding new friends, but eventually meets Kyla and they become close friends. However, it turns out Kyla is obsessed with Riley's father. Before you start, remember to like, share the video and subscribe to the channel. If you like to comment, do it. Riley Summer, a high school student, and her father, Chris Summer, a high school English teacher, have just moved to a new town and it is their first day at their new school. Kyla is also a student at the school, loves taking photos, and was taking candid photos for the school yearbook when her eyes fell on the new English teacher. Kyla and Chris have a completely normal student-teacher moment in class, but Kyla seems to have developed feelings for him when she catches him greeting Riley after class. She decided to find out how they knew each other. Kyla finds Riley in the computer lab and the two bond over art. Kyla finds out that Riley is Chris's daughter and immediately asks if she can come to her house to study English for the semester. So it's the first day of the semester and Kyla is pretty obsessed with Chris. She even discreetly took photos of him in the parking lot. This was the first red flag, but that afternoon, Kyla discovered her mother, Jess, was dating a guy she met at the grocery store. Jess is ready for her date. Kyla can't stop fantasizing about Chris, while Trisha, another girl in Chris's class, also has a crush on Chris and starts flirting with him, much to Kayla's disappointment. Trisha finds out that Chris is Riley's father and so she also tries to get closer to Riley. She advises Riley not to date Kyla and also invites him to go shopping with her, but Kyla sees all this and gets angry at Riley for talking to Trisha. In fact, she advises Riley not to date Trisha because Trisha is too obsessed with Chris, and Trisha seems to have a similar history of being obsessed with a history teacher at school, who was later murdered. Dismissal. As you can see, there have been many confusing dynamics between all these different players. Kyla reveals that she is actually 18 years old and casually asks Riley if Chris has always had students' crush on him. Riley assures him that it won't be a problem if the students have a crush on Chris, since he has high moral standards and apparently met someone he met at the grocery store. At this point, Kyla realizes that his mother is actually meeting Riley's father, and coincidentally, Chris shows up at Kyla's house at that exact moment to pick up Jess for a date. Jess doesn't realize Kyla is in the same class as Chris. She asked Kyla if dating her English teacher was too much for her, but Kyla had no problem. When Chris and Jess were about to go on a date, Kyla accidentally spilled water on Chris. Now Chris really doesn't have a spare shirt, so Kyla suggested that they just have the date at home and she could help them prepare dinner while they ate dinner. Kyla texts Riley, telling him it's weird that their parents are randomly dating at the same time. Kyla also tried her best to stop Chris and Jess from being intimate while Chris and Jess were kissing. Kyla shouted from her room. She ran downstairs and said someone outside the window was watching her while she was changing. Chris went out to check but no one was there. Apparently, Kyla said she would feel safer if she stayed with Jess and Chris all night, which would prevent them from taking things to the next level. Meanwhile, Chris tells Kyla that Riley went out for the night with Trisha so he can stay at their house. The next morning, Chris offers to drive Kyla to school with Riley when Riley searches for Kyla in a dark room at school. Kyla is furious that she went out with Trisha when she clearly said she shouldn't. She said the only reason Trisha hung out with her was to get closer to her father, but Riley said that Trisha explained to her that Kyla was the one who would be obsessed with the history teacher, not Trisha. This makes Kyla so angry that she threatens Trisha and warns her to stay away from Riley. That evening, Kyla took provocative selfies, apparently printed them out, and placed a bunch of them in her school locker. The next morning, she pretended to be humiliated and took the opportunity to talk to Chris. Meanwhile, Riley and Kyla reconcile and apologize to each other. Kyla admitted that she was the one who had the relationship with the history teacher last year, but she also lied that she took those provocative selfies for that history teacher and that Trisha must have taken these photos in public. That's what I'm talking about this girl's balls. That night, Chris went to Kyla's house because he had another meeting with his mother while he was in the bathroom. Kyla picks up the phone and receives several sexually explicit text messages, appearing to be from Trisha. She tells her mother about it, who then confronts Chris and breaks up with him while Kyla then sits back and enjoys it while a devastated and confused Chris sits in his car. Kyla left the house and suddenly arrived. She starts to get close to him and Chris is clearly uncomfortable. She climbs on top of him and starts kissing him, and even though Chris asks her to stop, we clearly see that he wants to give in to temptation. We then revealed that Kyla had been sending all these messages pretending to be Trisha, and Kyla took it a step further the next day when school administrators expelled Trisha because they found a phone broken has Trisha's photo on it. Kyla gives Riley a gift, but she's clearly more interested in finding Chris. She entered Chris's room without his knowledge and began massaging him. Chris is not in a good mood, but Kyla offers to please him. Chris knew exactly what she meant, but he seemed to have two opinions about it. He can't be intimate with her, but he really wants to, and in the end, he keeps her company. Unfortunately for him though, Riley walks in and catches him and Kyla in the act. Shocked, Riley runs away, and Chris follows her, and they argue in front of all of their guests. Riley leaves the party and Chris goes looking for her. He couldn't find her that night and didn't see her at school until the next morning, but she was too angry to talk to him. However, she contacted Jess about Kyla's inappropriate relationship with Chris, and when she found out, Jess showed up at school, slapped Chris several times, and quickly took Kyla with her. Now she also claims that Kyla made up lies about Trisha. Meanwhile, Chris apologizes to Riley and she forgives him. Kyla calls Trisha, asks her to meet her, then coaxes her into hitting her. When Trisha resisted and didn't hit her, Kyla started hitting herself and intentionally breaking her fingers like an absolute psychopath. Chris and Riley had just arrived in their car, heard Kyla moaning and went out to help her. Kyla told Chris that Trisha had broken her finger, so Riley called 911 and the police took Trisha to see Kyla in the hospital. Jess is now convinced that she wasn't lying about Trisha after all. Meanwhile, Riley confronts Kyla at the hospital to let her know that she is still mad at her and that Chris will never see her again, but Kyla still tries to convince Riley to be her replacement. Filming for the women's volleyball team's match. Reluctantly for the good of the team, Riley agrees. Kyla also asks Riley to give her one last chance to say goodbye to Chris, but when Chris comes to talk to her, Kyla says that now Jess and Riley think she won't see Chris anymore, so there will be no intervention anymore from the family in their life. Relationship. Chris, at this point shocked by Kyla's obsession, tries to make her understand that he doesn't share these feelings with her, not even remotely. He even said he would clean his office that night and quit work so Kyla would leave them alone. Chris arrives at school and calls Riley to ask her to help him clean up the classroom, but as Riley starts walking toward his father's classroom, someone turns off the lights and it turns out Kyla is running away from the hospital. She confronts Riley and stabbed her with a surgical knife. She went to Chris's class, threatened to slit his throat, and tried to have intimate relations with him while holding a knife to his throat. When Chris realized that Kyla had hurt Riley, he pushed her away himself, looking for her, but Kyla tried to stop him and accidentally tripped and hit his head. She dragged Chris's unconscious body and screamed at night. The janitor found her after hearing the screams. Seeing her in distress, he went to get help, but Kyla followed him while Riley, who was still alive, ran towards the concierge with bloody hands and asked her to run away, but it was too late. Like she was playing Among Us in real life. Kyla slit the throat of janitor, then runs after Riley, but Riley ultimately hits her and manages to take control. By this time Chris has regained consciousness and Riley and Kyla are both taken to a hospital. Months later, Chris and Riley have moved to a new place, and Chris is ready to take up a new teaching job. Riley is excited about her first day of college, but as Riley is driving off to college, we see a hooded figure who we can assume to be Kyla emerge from hiding, meaning that she's still obsessively following Chris. Part of the reason I love this movie is because, with the exception of the ending, it's not too ridiculous but is still incredibly suspenseful and quite shocking. My obsession throws many mind games at the viewer with deception, miscommunication, finger-pointing and unexpected social twists in the game of desire.